Alright, this is the first of a series of videos on evolution. Now, this last exam will actually be, in a way, pretty easy. You could probably get away with just watching the videos and very minimal, go and just shore up some things maybe you don't quite understand in the book. But most of this coming exam, which will be over evolution and photosynthesis, a little bit of extra on plants, not nearly as much material for this last test. But the idea here is you should be able to watch the videos, and then there'll be stories. I'll be telling stories here, not just going through the PowerPoints. And if you know the stories, you'll be able to answer the questions. If you don't watch the videos at all, you aren't going to be able to answer many of the questions. So it's either going to be very hard or very difficult. Very hard or very easy. Just watch the videos and you should do pretty well. All right, so we're going to start out with the definition here of a species. So here we have, oops, let me go back, wrong way. There we go. Our definition of a species. Hold on, I want to turn on there's let's see if I can do this. And mouse pointer. Okay, there's what I want. All right, so species. What does it mean to be a species? They're a group of related organisms that share a distinctive form. I don't like this definition. It doesn't give you much to go on. It's to some extent it's just a matter of arbitrary. Well, I think these two look alike, and that's not really a good definition, because some people might say something looks similar and other people wouldn't, and it might be enough to make it a species or not. I prefer this second one, a species that can produce sexually or reproduce sexually. In other words, they can breed. All right, to produce, and here's the key part: viable offspring. All right, in other words, if the two organisms can mate and have a child, all right, that one is viable. I'll explain viable in a second. But if they can have a child and it lives and it can also have children, all right, that's the actual definition of viable, then they're the same species. In other words, if I take, and I'm going to show you an example of this in a second, I can take a dog and a wolf and breed them, and they have an offspring that can also have children. Well, then that's a viable offspring, and that viable, it means it's a fertile offspring. Then, okay, they're the same species. Now I'm going to give you an example of this in, say, dogs and wolves. You normally don't think of them being the same species, but by this definition, they absolutely are. Because you can breed a dog and a wolf, and you will have a viable offspring. You can continue to breed that dog or that wolf-dog hybrid and continue to carry on that line. If, however, you have the child and the child offspring there, and it cannot reproduce, or it is unlikely that it can reproduce, then you might say they are not the same species. And that's where we will keep it there as the definition. And I'll give examples of this. And those examples are what you need to tell me on the test. So a population, though, what is a population? It's a group of organisms that are the same species. That means they can breed amongst one another and are likely to encounter one another. All right, so they have the opportunity to breed, all right, to reproduce. Now, an example of something where they might be near one another and can't would be maybe two groups of birds. They may be capable of breeding, all right, but let's say one of them looks for food during the day and sleeps at night, but the other one sleeps during the day and looks for food at night. I think I said that backwards, right? I'm hoping, in other words, let's see. One of them sleeps during the day and the other one doesn't. All right, and one of them eats during the day and the other one doesn't. They do the opposite, and so they should never run into one another. They may live in the same tree even. Maybe these birds could breed, but They don't, because they actually are never up and active while the other one is up and active, and they don't run into each other. And that would be the case of something that, well, they could breed, but they don't do it. And so that would not be the same population. Uh, it's kind of like they are the same species. If we go by this top definition, it means they could breed. All right, they're the same species, but because they don't ever do it, they are not of the same population. And we will leave this definition as it is right here. And so if you can keep that concept in your head, you'll get several questions right. In other words, understand the difference. Two species, two groups of organisms may be the same species, but if they don't run in, if they can't breed together, they're not the same population. All right, species, population. So keep those ideas in your head for the exam. Now here we're going to talk about three animals that look very similar. If you've watched the video on Don't Judge a Book, you understand where we're going with this kind of. But here we're going to look at zebras, donkeys, and horses and realize you can breed these organisms. All right, if you breed a horse and a zebra, all right, we call that a zorse. All right, if you breed a horse and a donkey, you call that a mule. And for the most part, yes, they can breed, they can have offspring, but those offspring are not viable. They either cannot have children, or in the case of the zorse, the grandchildren are always sterile. So in the case of the horse and the donkey, it produces a mule, and a mule is sterile. In the case of a zebra, it produces a zorse, and a zorse can go back and breed with a zebra or a horse, but the grandchild is always sterile. So they are also not the same species. They are not viable. Viable really means you can continue to breed them for indefinite number of generations. But in the case of the zorse, you can get one, and then you can get a grandchild, but you can't go past that. So they also are not the same species. All right, so we move down, and here's just some pictures I wanted to show you of what a zorse looks like. The top two up here, this one and this one, are zorses, and this is a mule. So in other words, you breed these two, and you get the mule. You breed these two, all right, and you get the zorse, and it really kind of a very pretty animal. And there is a story about the zorse that I normally tell in class. You won't need to know it here, but people have tried to race zebras before, but a zebra won't let you ride it. A zorse will let you ride it if you drug it. But there's a huge instinct in zebras to not let anything on its back, because basically it's a wilder animal than a horse that has things chasing it like lions. And so it has a very strong instinct to not let anything near its back. And so you cannot ride a zebra. But zebras are much faster than horses, and people have always wanted to breed zebras and horses to create fast horses. And actually with biotechnology these days, they probably are going to be able to do it and breed out that instinct maybe that won't let you ride it. And if they do, well, that will alter horse racing quite a bit, because you would be able to transfer. We can do that. We can transfer the genes that make the zorse or the zebra so fast into the horses and just bypass the breeding part altogether. Now we move on down to the wolves here. And so this is a wolf over here. This is a dog. Actually, it's a special dog named a dingo. And you breed them, and you can get a dog-wolf hybrid. And I've met a few of these over the years. And it looks like a dog. It kind of looks like a wolf. You can't quite tell. It's not quite as big as a wolf. But I will tell you that they are very aggressive. And so one of the main differences isn't just in the looks of the animal, but the behavior of the animal. And we now know how that works. There are genes for, basically they're called androgen genes, and they affect behavior. And these androgen genes, the wolf has essentially 8 copies. that are each triggered. In other words, it's kind of like adrenaline. If you know what adrenaline is, whenever you get scared, you get your heart races, and you're ready to fight or flight. If you understand how adrenaline works, and when it's released into your body, well, essentially, dogs have something similar to that in these genes, but they have 8 different kinds of it, and each one is triggered by a different behavior, like eating or shared eating behavior. So if you've ever had a dog that that growls at you and gets angry if you come near it when it's eating, well, that comes from the wolf, and you actually can breed that out of the dog. And this is one of the 8. And when you get down to just 1 or 2 of those androgen genes, you essentially have a dog. And there are certain physiological changes that come along with this. And for many years, we didn't know this. We've never been able to recreate whatever caused the combination of a dog, but we've kind of figured it out now, and we understand genetically what it is. Now, we have been able to essentially turn foxes into something closer to a dog. We've actually been able to breed a tame fox, but foxes can't breed with dogs. So at some point in history, it's assumed that humans bred these androgen genes out of the wolves to end up with dogs. And in other words, it was planned. And we're going to talk a lot about that because that is something that gave Darwin some clues about how evolution worked. We're going to talk about that quite a bit. And dog breeding is one of those things. In other words, what I'm saying is, if I want a bigger dog, I breed 2 medium-sized dogs, and maybe I get a bigger one. And then I take 2 bigger ones and breed an even bigger one. So I kind of pick the animals that can breed. This is selective breeding. And I can get what I want. If I want a small dog, I breed the smallest dogs in the litter together and get even smaller dogs. And that's how you get such a variety in dogs compared to a lot of other animals. Dogs really are quite varied in their size and shape and their behaviors. And that's because we've been breeding them a long time. Now, the interesting thing I want you to know here is I want to tell you a story, and it's a story about this type of dog. This dog over here. Let's see, I want to get rid of all the ink. This one here is a generic dog. It's a dingo, all right? And a dingo is very much a generic dog. It's what we could call the wild type. In other words, if you were to take many different breeds of dog, like we have down here, of all these strange, different-looking dogs, and if you were to just randomly start breeding them together over time, if there is any kind of environmental, if they have to work for a living, in other words, if they have to live in the wild, some are going to make it, others aren't. Some are too big, some are too small. And what you will end up after a few generations is you will end up with this dog. And it happens, and we know this happens because during some natural disasters, this has happened several times over history, there have been kennels that have kept dogs in their, many different types of dogs. So maybe all of these dogs were in a kennel, or many of them, but let's say just had these types. But during a natural disaster, what do you do with all the dogs? Well, a kennel will just release them, because if they leave them in their cages, if it floods or there's a fire, they're going to die no matter what. So what a kennel will do when this happens, they will just release them out into nature, if you can't get them out, with the hope that they can fend for themselves and at least maybe escape the nature using their instincts and whatever. Now, what we find is whenever this happens, you get a group of breeding dogs in the area that are of all different types. And over time, what happens, it doesn't take long, all right, on their own, these dogs will produce this dog right here. And on average, this takes just 5 or 6 generations. 5 or 6. And then all the dogs will essentially look like this. Now, why this dog? Well, this is what we call the wild type. This is the one that occurs naturally. So this is your natural dog if you were to just let nature take its course and let survival of the fittest, if you want to call it that, take over. In other words, a big dog probably can hunt and get food, but it probably needs too much water. It probably needs too much food, and it probably isn't, fast enough for every type of animal. But there'll be a few of them. They will certainly survive longer than, say, your these two down here, all right, or these three. These three, the problem is this guy's going to be too slow to catch larger animals, and these are going to get eaten by something else. So if there's, say, a cougar, a mountain lion, um, even this guy, all three of these are just going to be eaten. The big poodle is pretty smart. If you didn't realize poodles are smart, they are. And maybe this one can figure out how to survive. But these larger dogs, they need too much food. They're just a little too big to find enough food and water in the wild. And it's going to be difficult on them when times are tough. So what happens is only some of these are going to survive from generation to generation. And only the best of these are going to make it. And then they're going to interbreed, the ones that make it. And you're going to end up with this. And the interesting thing is, time after time, it only takes 5 or 6 generations, and all the dogs end up looking like this one. So it's a very good story. I would like you to know the kennel story. All right, so let's move on. Now we have Neanderthals and humans. The question is, are we the same species? All right, and the answer is, I believe so. By our definition, they certainly are, because we know that we have Neanderthal genes. We share genes with Neanderthals. So at some point we bred with them. For many, many decades, we supposed that they were a separate species. All right? But when we learned to sequence DNA, we learned that we had quite a bit of Neanderthal DNA in us that was not there before we interacted with them. And we know about the time we interacted with them, about 70 to 50,000 years ago. And during that time, when we were interacting with them, they died out. And they died out not because we always thought we killed them. We thought we came in numbers. There were many more humans. Our communities were in the hundreds, and their communities usually had only 1 or 2 families, so maybe at the most 30 or 35 people at the very largest. And so when humans moved in, we had large social groups, and even though the Neanderthals were much, much stronger and sturdier than we were, numbers count. And the interesting thing is, look at these skulls. Which of these is bigger? Which of these do you think had the bigger brain? The Neanderthal had the larger brain. Now, it wasn't up front. The up front part was probably is the part that we consider the human part, and it was roughly the same size as ours. What's bigger in the Neanderthal is this part in the back, and this is the part that controls coordination. So not only were the Neanderthals much larger and sturdier than us, they were probably slower, but they were very tough. In my normal class when I teach this, we go into quite a bit of detail about Neanderthals. But that lecture we do not have time for this semester. But the idea here is they would have been extraordinarily coordinated. So, when they go to throw a rock or to design a tool, they're going to be much more dexterous, all right? Their aim is probably going to be better. Their coordination, physical coordination would have been better, and they would have been much, much stronger than us. Not necessarily bigger. They were actually quite short. Maybe the men were 5'5", 5'6", but they would have all been 250 pounds and mostly muscle. They would have, if you would see a Neanderthal today, you would think, well, they look a little odd, but you would definitely think they were human. You would not think they were not human. You would definitely think they're human, just a bit odd looking. But they would have been far superior athletes, at least at certain types of things, than we were. All right, so keep that. That's a story I want you to know. I want you to know that we did not kill them off. I want you to know that we bred with them. And I think the most anybody's ever found is someone with 6% Neanderthal DNA. There are some people say that's not large enough for them to be considered surviving, so we bred them out of existence, and so they're not the same species. I don't think that argument makes sense. The argument is, could you breed with them or could you not? And you could, so therefore we're the same species. And many people, most people have some. The average is 2 or 3%, and I've heard of people having 6%, maybe more. But that's about it. So, interestingly, the genes that survive in us that come from the Neanderthals, the ones that obviously were better at making you survive, were immune system genes. Or we inherited their immune system. So obviously they had a superior immune system, and most of those genes were inherited into humans today. So that 6%, that's usually what they did, what we gained from them. All right, now we have the history of the theory of evolution. I am not going to ask you about John Ray, but I will ask you about Linnaeus, and he proposed that evolutionary change promotes the formation of new species. In other words, change, whatever causes evolutionary change, usually a change in the environment or something like that, causes the formation of new species. And Linnaeus is also famous for creating the classification system we have. And to represent that, I have here the tree of life. And so you hear these names like Homo sapiens. That's a human. All right. And so a Homo sapien, you have these Latin terms. And this is how you design. These are all of the branches going back to the idea of there was an original organism that led to all other organisms. That's the theory, and this produces a tree of related species. In other words, some organisms look very similar and are thought to have come from the same group of organisms, but now they can no longer breed together for one reason or another, and therefore we have to call them a new species. But we relate all the species, and we do that using this tree of life, which shows the relationship. Now, the interesting thing, this is an old one, and it starts up here, plants and animals, and then Protista was everything, a lot of more microorganisms and algae, things like that, that didn't fall into quite plants or animals. Now, we don't use that as the top three anymore. We don't use plants and animals. We actually have eukaryotes, prokaryotes, and archaea, which we talked about in the previous video. All right, so you need to know that, in other words, life adapts. There are mutations, and good mutations give you a chance for increased survival success and on increased in reproductive success. And so those two things lead to change over time, because the animals, or the organisms, I shouldn't say just animals, but organisms that survive and do well are more likely to have more children, and therefore they pass on their genes, whereas an organism that doesn't do very well doesn't pass on its genes, and therefore is less likely to have its genes found in some future time. And that's basically the idea here, is organisms change over time through this process of passing on the genes that best adapt you for your environment. Now, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he didn't quite see evolution the way we see it today. And he's famous for making a very famous story about giraffes, and I want you to know that story. But I also want you to know that Lamarck is now, we're finding out, maybe his ideas aren't so crazy because of something called epigenetics. And we touched on epigenetics at the end of the last test. And there are some things that make us think now that maybe Lamarck is true in just a slight way. But not, actual evolution doesn't utilize it very much, but it's there. And hopefully I will get to that so you'll understand it. But I do want you to know why Lamarck is famous. It's because he told what today we see as a really ridiculous story. But it made complete sense, several hundred years ago. And it's actually making a comeback in a weird way with this idea of something we call epigenetics. And I hope we do get to that at the end. But here is Lamarck's idea. The idea was you have a giraffe, and this first generation of giraffes like to eat this plant, and this first generation is trying to eat the plant, and but its neck isn't long enough. But because it's stretching its neck a lot, in other words, it's using its neck muscles a lot and stretching its neck, somehow that exercise, if you want to call it that, leads to its children to have longer necks. And this, since this is a tall plant, then obviously this one is going to also stretch its neck, all right, to get to the leaves that are even higher in this particular plant, if this is the type of plant that it likes to eat. And so as it stretches its neck its whole life, that's going to cause even the next generation finally to have an even longer neck. So the thing is, what Lamarck was saying is, the things you do in your life, the parts that you use, the activities, the behaviors that go on, somehow affect the nature of your offspring. Now, this is not how we view evolution and how things change currently. The epigenetics is a very tiny, slight issue with this, but other than that, this is not how we view it. Evolution is a very slow-acting thing. This would be relatively fast, all right? And, of course, Lamarck was never able to show this actually happening because evolution is a very slow process, and we will talk a lot about that. But the idea here is it does kind of spark the idea that something must be causing it. What is it, or how is it working? And that's, Darwin read Lamarck, and he said, well, this isn't the way it works. It's got to be some other way. But it did kind of ask the question, how does the environment affect the nature of children? All right. In other words, the environment has to somehow control the nature, the differences that occur in your children. So we're going to have to talk about that. But Lamarck was the first one to do this. And if you want a funny story, if Lamarck were right and it worked this way, if you were a bodybuilder, let's say, and so you worked out and you ended up looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. So you worked out your whole life, you got all these big muscles. Well, according to Lamarck, this would say that when your children were born, they would all be little muscle-bound little babies. In other words, your children would just automatically have big muscles because you worked out the whole time. In other words, instead of stretching your neck, causing your neck to be longer, well, the equivalent would be that, if you worked out and were a bodybuilder, well, your kids would end up being, looking like dad. And if they built their muscles up, then they would look even more like whatever it is you're working out. So, of course, we know that doesn't work that way. So his giraffe story, or if you want to call it the Arnold Schwarzenegger story, that doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. Evolution works in a completely different way. All right. So, but we do need to know about Lamarck and what he thought. He thought that something you did in your life affected the nature of your children. And give him credit a little bit with this epigenetic stuff, which we learn maybe your diet does. That's what we've learned. And so hopefully we get to that before the end of the semester. All right. Now, another thing that we need to keep in mind that affects evolution is slow. All right. And we need to understand where people are coming from when we say that geology is slow. Darwin actually studied many things, and one of them was geology before he came up with his idea, and he knew that geology worked very slow, and so he borrowed this idea. He borrowed the idea that he knew that, like the Grand Canyon was cut out over millions of years by the Colorado River. So the Colorado River cut out something really huge like the Grand Canyon, but it took a long time. It did not do that overnight. And so there was this idea that nature works slowly. And especially in geology, mountains get torn down to deserts, and then using geology, we know that the mountains then rise back up slowly. There are, tectonic plates and things like that. But, you don't create a mountain overnight, and you don't flatten that mountain overnight either. These things are created, and they're created very slowly, or destroyed very slowly. And so the idea is nature is slow, and Darwin borrowed that. He got that idea from geology. Now, the next one is population growth. This is also something that Darwin borrowed. He read a guy by the name of Malthus. And Malthus is actually a famous, not just biologist, but economist. And he's the guy who came up with the idea of cycles. Like a business cycle, if you're into business, you know what a business cycle is. There are good times followed by bad times. All right, good times, bad times. All right, right now the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s were good times, and then in 2008 everything dropped, and I don't know if things are back yet, but if they were, well, we're back down. This is the idea, all right, that in economics, but he studied it based on population, not on wealth in the normal way. You see, Malthus worked for the church at the time, the Church of England, I believe. And they were worried about how much money they had coming in. And they noticed that some years they had lots of money, and then, 20 years later they had very little, and then 20 years after that they had more money again, and what was going on. And they told Malthus, go figure this out. Find a way to make it steady. And what he found out was that it all had to do with population. And he found out that during good times, people had more children. All right, and then during bad times, the people didn't have enough food. People got sick, died of disease, and there weren't very many people. And then, of course, if they didn't have many children, the next population was not very large. So what Malthus said, that only some people it's not steady. In other words, we have good times, and then we have bad times. And during good times, he said we overproduce. In other words, you have way too many children when times are good, and then when times are bad, well, a lot of these children die of starvation and disease. And so then you have very few people, and then when there aren't as many people to grow up, and so therefore there aren't that many people going to church and giving them money. But this was all because, I really find it funny, that it was all because the church wanted to flatten the amount of money coming in, and they didn't want this, they didn't understand why, and it all came down to just the number of people changed, and it was due to good times versus bad times. And there was kind of a lag there between the good times and then how many people there were, but he clearly showed that this occurred, and he came up with this concept of the cycle that we see in all kinds of things these days in modern times. But that's what made Thomas Malthus famous, and actually he's quoted by economists a lot, but he's just as equally quoted by biologists for his influence on Darwin and the concept of cycles, and this idea that only the population that survives is going to be contributing to the future. And of course, that's right out of Survival of the Fittest right there. So it's easy to see how Darwin got his ideas. He got it from geology. It was slow, and then he borrowed this idea. So there were lots of places that Darwin was drawing on to come up with his theories. All right, now Darwin himself was born in 1890. I've already mentioned the geology and the economics. The biggest thing he did was his voyage on the Beagle. Now, I need you to watch a movie for this. So there is a movie that you must watch on YouTube. I will give you a link, and when I tell you to watch this movie, one of the things you need to be paying attention to is his voyage. There are lots of things he discovered, and combining these things all led to him coming up with the idea of natural selection and evolution. Now realize he wrote a book, and that book, I think it only mentions evolution 2 or 3 times that he does use the word evolution. The book is on something called natural selection. And so we need to distinguish at some point in the next couple of videos the difference between natural selection and evolution. I'm not going to do it here. But between these three plus dog breeding, because he realized, hey, dog breeding, you're changing these animals. How does that going on? Dog breeding. All right. These three plus, these three plus this one, so 4 topics. So if I ask you a question, which is a hint, I am going to ask you this question, where did Darwin get his ideas? You say geology. He borrowed the idea of things being slow from economics. That's Malthus. He borrowed the idea that there are cycles. And from the voyage, well, you'll have to watch the movie to figure that one out. But dog breeding, he gained the idea that you could breed these animals and get different animals, and you could choose. Now, this is selective breeding. In other words, this is human interaction causing the breeding. But he, of course, took this and said, well, why can't nature do this? Why can't simple survival breed the dogs? In other words, the dogs that survive are the ones that breed. And so that comes a lot from Malthus. And then, of course, it could take a long time. The thing that you have left to learn about is what he learned on his voyage. And so you'll need to watch the movie to get this last part. But I am definitely asking lots of questions on where Darwin got his ideas. So you need to know geology, economics, dog breeding. You might even need to throw in a little Lamarck on there. That's not a required one, but certainly I will ask you about Lamarck, but that's probably going to be as a counter to Darwin. Why does Lamarck's ideas, why didn't they, why weren't they taken more seriously, or why aren't they taken seriously today? And it's because, well, we know Darwin's, and Darwin's makes a lot more sense, and we don't see Arnold Schwarzenegger having little baby bodybuilders. All right, so that's kind of the idea. Or giraffes, short neck giraffes stretching their necks and having longer neck giraffes. We don't see that sort of thing. All right, now here, one of the things that you need to watch when you watch the movie is pay attention to the finches. They're going to talk about these finches. This is a place where you might want to read the book, all right, to understand how the issue with the finches work. The finches are little birds. And you need to know kind of what he did on his voyage. Where did he go? He went to South America first, and he did see some interesting things with some fossils there. And then he went to the Galapagos. They came back, but these are the 2 places where he got most of his ideas. So you need to understand here why the big deal was with the fossils, and the movie will tell you that. And here you need to understand about the finches, and they also talk about turtles and other things. But you need to watch the movie, the documentary, to get the idea behind what's going on the voyage and why the voyage was popular. All right, now he came up, he wrote his book, he got his idea in 1840, but he was very much afraid that if he wrote the book and published it during his life, he would be highly criticized. And he didn't care if he got criticized, but he did care about his wife, so he decided not to print his book. Because he was waiting basically until they were old, and just to keep the stress off his wife. But a guy in 1858 was going to steal his ideas. Apparently his ideas got out, and he was going to kind of say jump the gun on Darwin. And so Darwin went ahead and published his book on the origin of species. And it's really all about natural selection, not so much evolution. But evolution is the part that has stuck that people don't like. Natural selection can be proven in the laboratory. We can show natural selection. We can show natural selection with my story of the dogs escaping from the kennel. That's natural selection. Evolution, however, is a much harder thing to show, and I'll need to explain that to you. In fact, you can never prove evolution. Evolution is just simply our best theory to explain what we see. We can't do experiments on it unless you do, a million-year experiment, keeping track the whole time, or invent a time machine. Maybe you could prove evolution. But it's the best theory we've got, and it uses the idea of natural selection just carried on for millions of years. So really what we focus on this class is understanding natural selection. If you understand natural selection, then you just say, well, carry it out to its logical conclusion if you let natural selection go on for a million years. If you let natural selection go on for a million years, you end up essentially with evolution. So the main idea for this class is for us to understand what natural selection is, and then you can make your own conclusions about evolution. All right, these are the terms you need to be familiar with. You need to understand variation. Variation just means that, hey, we're all a little different, and within any species you have different traits, longer hair, different colored eyes, taller, shorter, fatter, thinner, different traits. Every species has got a little bit of variety, and so variety is the key to evolution working, or natural selection working. You have that variety, and that variety gives you some adaptability. If the environment changes, people with these variations that help them survive are going to pass on their genes. The people who have genes that don't help you survive in this new environment, they are not as likely to survive and are not going to pass on their genes. All right, so understand that variation is part of the theory of evolution. Natural selection, we will go into a lot more detail, especially in the movie. You can watch the movie. The idea is more offspring can survive. There's competition for resources. So it's essentially what I'm saying when I said there's variation in how it works. So when you have variation, basically the people with the variants, the traits that are better, flourish and have more kids, and therefore those end up being the genes that are in the people in the future, and the traits that used to be there, if they don't disappear completely, they are rare traits because they are not survival traits in the current environment. If the environment changes, a different set of traits will be the ones that contribute to the future generations. And the ones that used to be good are no longer part of the species, or they may still be in your genome, but they will be ones that are going to hinder you versus help you. And so maybe you get 3 good ones and 1 bad one. Okay, that you survived. Someone else might get a different 3 good ones and a different bad one, bad trait. And so maybe that's good enough to survive. So maybe not all bad traits disappear. But when the environment changes, maybe those bad traits end up being good traits. Like living in a desert, you need different traits than if you live near the ocean. Although the traits that you might need in those 2 places might be completely different. And when you move from one to the other, you're not going to do as well if you're not used to the conditions. And over time, people will adapt to those. And we see that. That's natural selection. And we see that even today. Now, we don't see speciation from this, and that's evolution. So take natural selection and then somehow lead to different species, and you have evolution. And that, of course, takes millions of years. At least tens of thousands. All right, now here's just on the finches. You might want to look at this in the book. I will ask some questions about the finches. The movie takes care of the finches pretty well, but this is something you probably ought to take a look at in the book. And I think I'll stop here, and I'll continue this video at some other time. I'll make another video continuing this topic in this chapter.